Phantom Tales. Your fear starts now. Back in 2002, Japan was rocked by a discovery so horrifying that it's hard to believe it happened at all. At a busy Tokyo train station, a fire broke out in one of the train cars. An electrical malfunction, they said. Chaos erupted. People scrambled to escape, leaving behind bags, suitcases, and one unspeakable secret. In one of those abandoned bags, police made a nightmarish discovery. Inside was a teenage girl, her limbs cruelly amputated, her body wrapped tightly in plastic. Tiny holes had been poked through the wrapping, just enough to keep her alive. She couldn't scream, her vocal cords had been surgically removed. And yet, somehow, there were no signs of fresh violence. No blood, no obvious injuries. But the scene, it was pure horror. Her body was twisted and deformed. Written on the bag in black marker was the number 72. Inside, they found a notebook. It wasn't a diary or a cry for help. Instead, it listed cold, clinical details, her allergies, her menstrual cycle, and medical notes like she was some kind of project. The police tried desperately to get answers. Who had done this? How had she ended up here? But she couldn't speak. She couldn't write. There was no way to tell her story. Her name was Yumi Tanaka. She'd been missing for 3 years. 3 long years where her parents, grieving, hopeless, had assumed she was dead. But she wasn't. And the story she eventually told, it was worse than anything they could have imagined. It began in 1999. Yumi was just a girl, walking home from school, when a man approached her. He had a warm smile and a calm demeanor. He told her that her parents had sent him to pick her up. She didn't question it. Why would she? Trustingly, she got into his car. That's when everything changed. The man blindfolded her. He sprayed something in her face. And before she could even cry out, she was unconscious. When Yumi woke up, she was somewhere else entirely. A bright, sterile room. She was locked in a cage. And she wasn't alone. 2 other girls were trapped with her, their eyes wide with fear. In the center of the room was an operating table. And behind it, a man. He wore surgical scrubs, and in his hands was an electric saw. Yumi watched in terror as he leaned over one of the girls. One of her legs was already gone, and her arm was freshly bandaged. Now he was preparing to take the other leg. The sound of the saw filled the air. Yumi couldn't look away. Her eyes darted to the far wall, and what she saw there was even worse. Girls, motionless, breathing, blinking. Their bodies were mutilated, their limbs stolen. The horror was too much. Yumi fainted. When she came to, she was strapped to a bed. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat felt empty, hollow. Her left arm was numb. She turned her head and saw the truth. It was gone. Her arm had been amputated, the stump stitched neatly, almost like it was routine. The silence in that place was suffocating. None of the girls could scream. Some struggled against their restraints, pulling uselessly at chains. Others just lay there, staring blankly, tears streaming silently down their faces. Yumi lost all sense of time. Days? Weeks? She couldn't tell. Every day they drugged her. Every day they fed her 3 meals, if you could call it that. At first, she knocked the tray onto the floor, eating like a caged animal. She never saw her captor. She never saw anyone except the other girls. The isolation drove her to the brink of madness. And then, the others began to disappear. One by one, the girls were taken. When they came back, they were missing another limb. Weeks passed. At least she thought it was weeks. Time blurred. Eventually, Yumi lost her left leg. That was when they moved her to a place they called the exhibition hall. The hall was clean, sterile. It smelled fresh, almost pleasant. A mockery of the nightmare within. The walls were lined with platforms, each holding a girl like some grotesque display. Each platform had a label like it was an art gallery. In the center of the room was an operating table and an empty cage. For the first time, Yumi saw the man responsible. He wasn't what she expected. He had a kind face, framed by a gray beard, and the calm demeanor of a grandfather. He didn't look like a monster, but what he did, he unstrapped her from the bed. For a moment, Yumi saw a chance. She lunged, trying to bite him, but he was ready. Calmly, he pushed her back. With precision and skill, he attached a metal plate to her back, securing it to her skull and pelvis. The fasteners had already been embedded in her spine. The procedure was meticulous, mechanical, like he'd done it 100 times before. Then he brought out a padded shield, a kind of frame about 5 feet long. He placed her against it, strapped her in, and hung her on the wall. Like a trophy, he left the room. The lights went out, and the silence, it was deafening. That first night, Yumi didn't sleep. She couldn't. All around her, she heard breathing, blinking. It was louder than any scream she'd ever heard. Days passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into restless sleep. When she woke, the room was bright. The other girls were arranged in rows, their faces painted with makeup. They looked perfectly like dolls. And that's when it hit her. This man had been collecting them for years. They were all the same, dark-haired, pale-skinned, young Japanese girls. A twisted gallery of his victims. The man returned, carrying a bottle of liquid. Methodically, he moved from girl to girl, pouring the contents into their mouths. Then water, then inspections, adjustments, powder, hair, and then the amputations began. 3 at a time, he chose them. Their final limbs were taken, wrapped in plastic, and stored away like trophies. Yumi knew her time was coming. She braced herself, but nothing could prepare her. Eventually, she heard the hum of a vehicle, voices, and then she was found. Years later, they caught the man. But justice was never served. He died mysteriously before his trial. The place where the other victims were held was never found. And even now, every year, tens of thousands of people go missing in Japan. Most of them are children,